Good day, chess world. So today we begin a wonderful new series where we will be going through Capablanca's Best Endgames. This is based on the book by Chernev of the same title, and we will be going through 60 wonderful endgames that Capablanca played to demonstrate some amazing principles that you can apply to your game. The purpose of this series is to help grow your strategic knowledge of what you're aiming for in good endgames, to give you endgame planning, to give you a mechanism of how to play, how to apply yourself. And as usual with my series, if you would like the notes, please sign up in the link so that I can send and share the notes for your self-study, and you can take it forward on this growth. So this game that we have is a wonderful game of Capablanca against Corzo, Havana, 1901. We must understand, Corzo, this was part of their match to decide who was the best player in all of Cuba. And Capablanca was a very young player at this time and was this young mega talent. And it is so unexpected for a young player to play endgames as well as he does. This game is going to demonstrate to you, number one, the effectiveness of the bishop battling the knight when pawns are on both sides of the board. And number two, how do we use the outside passed pawn once we have it to convert a chess ending? That is the big theme from Capablanca. So we take this position, and the position may look very, shall we say, drawish. In chess, we have this wonderful change of the English language. What we mean by that is it has some tendencies that could head towards a draw. But actually, the position is quite preferable for white, even though we don't say white has an advantage. It's just easier to play for white, and the planning for white is much more simple. So I want you to think, if you were playing here with the white pieces, how would you approach this position? What would you do? Now, let's take it forward. Let's get an understanding of the big moments. This position is equal. If you were to go look with the silicon monster stockfish, it will tell you 0-0. But that doesn't tell the whole story. Right now, white is that tiny bit better. The reason for that is their king is better. It's immediately threatening the pawn. The bishop is better because it can threaten a pawn. And in the endgame, I want you to remember, you have two plans. Plan number one, attack your opponent's weak pawns. Plan number two, use your passed pawns. Here, Capablanca is doing exactly this. The goal and the intention of these plans is to tie down your opponent. Very important, tie down your opponent. So this is what we see from Capablanca already. So what he does is a nice preventative move. He says, well, I won't want to see g5 check, because with his king in this scenario, he would like to attack both f5 and e5. Wonderful. So the move here from Capablanca is h4, preventing g5. His opponent plays g6. Now, if we just unpack something which is great for your positional chess to remember, is that if, for example, black were to play h5, this would be a small error because now white can play h5, and this one pawn would create what we call a blockade, stopping these two pawns from advancing, because, of course, if the pawn jumped to g5, en passant. And suddenly, let's take a look at that. g5, oops, pawn takes, king takes, and now the enemy king will invade. So very important that we see this detail and tie down the opponent in this effective manner. So, of course, he plays g6. He wants to slowly push h6 and then g5. That slow progression is good for you to remember. So Capablanca now plays g4, seeking to create more weaknesses. Now, the planning from black actually should be to simplify. When you stand worse in the endgame, in many cases, a good idea is to trade off pawns. And that is what the opponent should do. Instead, Corzo plays pawn to h6. He still wants to get his plan of g5. Well, Capablanca says, no, that's not happening, and pushes g5 check. Pawn takes, pawn takes. And now, in this tiny little moment, Capablanca has created a big plus. What is that plus? Yes, it's a check. Great. But let's see who of you are actually smart and clever here. Tell me in the comments below. Let's see who can put it in. Who's first? What is the problem that Capablanca has created for black? What is the good thing that white has done strategically here? Well, he has fixed this pawn on g6. Now that might seem like a nothing. Why is that a big deal? Well, actually, it's very important because he has fixed that pawn on a light square. That is a potential target for us to remember. Typically, the bishop is better than the knight if there is play on both sides of the board. Why? Because the bishop's advantage is it can move quickly from one side of the board to the other. Now here, the bishop needs targets. It needs something to attack. By fixing g6, this is very important, that is a long-term weakness and a long-term problem. So great. Pawn on g6 is fixed. White then decides to play their king back to e7, which is correct. It is all fine. Now we need to figure out a plan of how do we get at g6 here. Because we fixed that target, it's a back pawn, but our bishop cannot hit that pawn. What do we do? What plan can you find? Think about this. Take a moment. Well, the correct plan from Capablanca here, remember plan number 1 in the endgame, is attack your opponent's weak pawns. So we have that pawn on g6. We want to get to that pawn. So he plays g4. Very nice indeed. The point is very clear that after pawn would capture, later white will bring their bishop to this square. So what does Capablanca do? He follows this plan immediately. Pawn takes g4, bishop d3, a great move. And this will be very surprising, but this move is part of a chain that wins the game for Capablanca. Now, it's not that this move is crushing, but it now confronts his opponent with problems he didn't expect, which are valuable in your games, because his opponent simply thought, no, 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 you're just going to take back here, and I am doing fine. He, as a matter of fact, thought you would play bishop takes g4, he will jump in with a knight, he is fine. But this move surprised him. So with this move of bishop d3, the opponent is now going to have to defend their weakness. It is important for us to see that g3 does nothing. The king will simply take and be fine. So black has some problems. Black now plays knight to f5. Not at all correct. This is a mistake. We, of course, in this endgame, don't have a big enough advantage that we could win without errors from the opponent. Here, we need to put pressure on the opponent and take advantage of the errors under that pressure. That's a big deal. We take an endgame like this, we follow this planning. Plan number 1, attack the opponent's weak pawns. And I want you to see how the opponent is tied down now. Now their knight is pinned to the pawn. So what does Capablanca do? King takes g4. Wonderful move. Why? Because now we are, of course, threatening to capture. Very important for your future understanding and this wonderful theme. King to e6 is simply lost. Why? Because bishop takes f5 check, pawn takes, king here, and now the outside pass pawn wins in the king and pawn endgame. That pawn on the edge of the board, big deal. This is where I will introduce you to an important theme. It's a nice little term I've coined, which is that king and pawn endgames are evaluated as won, lost, or drawn. Only 3 evaluations. And it sounds quite ridiculous, like I'm introducing nothing new to you, because isn't every single chess game won, lost, or drawn? Well, no, we're talking about the evaluation. In this position, while the minor pieces are on the board, black is worse, yes, but they're not lost. Whereas king and pawn endgames are so finite in their nature that there is only 3 ways to evaluate it. Before you enter it, you should know, is it won for me? Is it drawn? Hopefully you're not entering it because it's lost. Now, it does not mean that just because the endgame is a 1 king and pawn endgame, that one side cannot make mistakes. It's always possible. But what I want to highlight to you here is that black should be aware, before they play king e6, what is the result of that king and pawn endgame? Well, it's clearly lost because of the power of the outside pass pawn. Let's quickly unpack that again. King e6, bishop takes, pawn takes, king here. How does white win? Well, first of all, it's clear as can be that black cannot move the king away. They would simply lose this pawn. So let's say a5 is an example. Then white can calmly take away moves, play b3. Let's say b5 in this position, a3, b4, and now out of principle a4. Why? When you stand better in the endgame, trade pieces, not pawns. That's very important, because there's more pawns then for you to win. So the king now has this problem. It is what we call zugzwang. Whatever move black plays, they will weaken their position. So the king moves, king takes, and now white will follow a simple procedure, send the king to eat up all these pawns while the black king is kept busy by this outside pass pawn. So wonderful, great theme there. Keep that in your mind, the importance of the outside pass pawn. Keep this principle as we've just seen here, because notice the technique from white. We are not seeking to push the pawn and win with the pawn. We are seeking to win because of the pawn. And I know it sounds a little bit like it's Confucius who's writing here about chess positions, but the principle is very valuable. It is the principle of two weaknesses in action in this endgame. It's very simple. You win generally because of the outside pass pawn, not with it. And this is a superb example, because we distract the opponent using this pass pawn, and then we go after their weakest pawn. Remember plan number one. We can use both plans in conjunction here, which is wonderful. So in this position, as we can see, after the king takes, they cannot play king takes e6, so they play the knight takes d4. Wonderful for us to see. Now, what do? We take that pawn on g6. Now let's understand what has just happened here. We are still equal on material. Black has 4 pawns, white has 4 pawns. But white has grown their advantage. Why? We're equal in material. What has happened? Now we have an asymmetrical pawn structure. They are not a mirror of each other. Previously, it was what we call symmetrical. Both sides had g-pawns, and all the rest of the pawns were very much a mirror of each other. Now that we have asymmetry, where white has this passed g-pawn on the outside, and black has the inside potential pass pawn, white is much better. Why? The bishop enjoys when the play is stretched, when there are pawns and activities on all sides of the board. So the bishop is great at stopping black's plans and helping the pawn to move forward. What a wonderful position, endgame-wise, for white. So here, Corzo plays pawn to c5. What is the duty? What is our plan? What should we do? Plan number one in the endgame: attack the opponent's weak pawns. Which pawn should we go after? Well, the bishop can only attack these because it must attack them on the light square. Can it get after d5? Nope. Can it get after b7? Nope. So therefore, we use plan number two. Use your pass pawns. Now, it's very important. Use. So often in chess literature, I want to shatter this fake news where they tell you, push your pass pawns. No, 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 no. Use it. There are different ways to use it. And as we'll see in this case, part of our goal is to push it, but we need to prepare the path first. So Capablanca, so superb, king h5. The king is going to help gain control of these squares, and now alarm bells need to be ringing for black, because white is preparing the path for that pawn to run forward. So the knight comes back to e6. He plays king to h6. The king goes back to f8. Black has to be very careful as to what's happening. Bishop to f5, and now we see this concept. The knight has to move. Knight g7. We already know if king to g7, remember what I showed you earlier? Hopefully this will begin to stick. King and pawn endgames are won, lost, or drawn. So from black's point of view, before they play king e7, they would have to look. Is that king and pawn endgame lost? Yes. King to e7, let's run through it quickly again. Bishop takes, captures, bye-bye. The pawn is gone and will become a new queen very quickly because the king assists at its advance in this case. So with knight g7, The knight has had to come across the board and stop this passed pawn. And I want you to see it is impossible for us to win with this pawn on its own, because we can never break this blockade in this case here. But we can win because of the passed pawn. So the bishop skips across the board, bishop to c8. The pawn must move. Then he simply plays g6, tying down the opponent. Not the only way to go about this, but Capablanca has an intention and a plan. The opponent pushes, and now we see the negative. We cannot win any of these pawns. Why? Because they're all on dark squares. So what does Capablanca do? He decides to play b3. Very smart, because he takes note that the opponent wants to play pawn to c4 and create their own dangerous passed pawn, which could be a problem. Now, it's not immediately out of control, but certainly pawn to c4 could become problematic. So he decides to play b3. King to g8, a4. He fixes these queenside pawns here. He fixes them so they cannot really move. Their structure cannot change. Notice there is no advances there. King to f8. But now what? Why has he fixed them? What is the intention? Well, the plan is very simple, and we're learning this one. Fix your opponent's weak pawns, and then you go win them. But fix them before they move. But what's going to win them? Of course, the king. So he plays here a wonderful move. Bishop to g4. Another nice tip, by the way, as we see a little bit of repetition from Capablanca. The idea here is the bishop sits 2 squares away from the knight, allowing it to dominate the knight's advance. Very, very instructive. So now the knight jumps back to e8. The king moves to h7, knight to g7, bishop to king back to h6, and we have the same position. Now Capablanca realizes he's going to have to win in a different way. So he plays his bishop round to e2, the knight goes to g7, bishop to c4. As you can see, black is very much paralyzed, struggling for moves. So the knight goes to e8, and now Capablanca begins his plan, king g5. It's another term I want you to remember when we understand chess endgames. Play endgames slowly, slowly. Slowly on the clock, and slowly on the moves. What do we mean by slowly on the moves? If you notice what Capablanca did, he first repeated the position, making his opponent prove that he knew how to defend that. Then he came back and went elsewhere. He did not rush to his win. He didn't preemptively going, oh, there is no win there, and automatically make it easier for the opponent. Not at all. So now the opponent has to head off Capablanca's king. So, of course, knight g7 is not possible here. The king would march itself in with great success, which is important. So Capablanca's opponent instead plays this move now in this scenario of king to e7. I do want to just highlight, if king g7, Capablanca had a very nice intended plan. He intended to play bishop b5, saying that if the opponent's knight now went to f6, he would create a winning zugzwang. But how? What would he do? Of course, bishop here. Again, I want you to see this trick in the endgame. Put the bishop 2 squares away from the knight, and that allows it to dominate the knight. And suddenly the knight can only make backwards moves, and then there is the potential for his king to join into the game. Very nice bit of planning that Capablanca had. Of course, he's not going to rush with those moves. The opponent plays king to e7, king to f5, knight check. What should we do? Well, we're going to win because of the pass pawn, not with it. So the king moves to e5, the opponent plays knight h5. And now we can see something else that is valuable in the battle of bishop versus knight in the endgame. Why the bishop can outplay the knight in many cases. Notice how the knight can change color. The knight can create this blockade on the dark squares. But as we're about to discover, the problem for the knight is it cannot lose moves, whereas the bishop can. So he plays a wonderful move. Bishop to e2, knight to g7, and now we get this very nice move here, where he plays king d5. Not the only way to win, but certainly efficient and effective. The detail is that after the king were to move to d7, he would play bishop check, and now the black king has to make a choice. Does he abandon his knight on the king's side, or does he abandon his queenside pawns? And we have forced zugzwang. Whatever move black plays, they will lose. If they play king to c7, we will go across. And yes, we are going to win that knight because it is tied down to stopping the passed pawn. And if the king goes to the other side, our king will go in and we will gobble up all of these pawns. Even though when we take a close look at this position, it's rather clear that it does not matter if the king will come to win this pawn, because we have traded the pawn in for all of these other weak pawns. Very, very instructive for us to see at this stage. Wonderful. And again, I want you to see this principle. You win because of the passed pawn, not with it. Notice if we just tried to rush through that pawn, it would be so difficult because the opponent blockades with the weaponry we have. They put a knight, a minor piece, and a king. We use a minor piece and a king, but we tie them down and strike elsewhere. So in the game, let's understand what happened, because in the game, we get the reverse situation where the knight immediately skipped back to e8. Capablanca says, thank you. I will run across and gobble up on that side. The knight went to g7, king b7. Now he played king d6. He is desperately hoping to create a zugzwang on white. King to c7. He is boxing in the king. But unfortunately for him, that is not possible because the king will escape. And if the king tries to come up, bishop check, too many problems. Knight to e8. Okay, what should we do now? We have won a pawn. And in so many of your games, you'll be up a pawn in the endgame. But how do we win? What should we do? Remember the principle of two weaknesses. The idea is to tie down the opponent and then create a new weakness. So the first element that Capablanca does is quite simple. He improves his bishop. It's not a must-have, but it's a nice to do. And this is where I want you to understand a little concept that we work on in my courses and training. This concept of a strategic plan. That's very important. A strategic plan. It's a little mini plan, if you will, a to-do list of how you will conduct yourself. You are in complete control of this endgame. Your opponent can do nothing except take advantage of your errors. So don't rush. So what is our plan? Well, let's start with that little to-do list, if you will. Number one, we want to improve our bishop so we don't have to worry about the pawn. So where do we want the bishop? Well, Capablanca decides he likes f7 and the effect that that will have on the opposing knight. Then we need plan number two. We need to attack the opponent's weak pawn. What weak pawn? Where is this weak pawn? Aha, b6. But if we push a5, we're simply trading. Then we discover what we are going to do is place our king on b5 to target this and then undermine the opponent's pawn structure. Very important. I also hope you're noticing an advanced concept. How do we attack a pawn structure and a pawn chain? Generally, we attack the pawn chain at its base. Notice what was done earlier. Here we have this pawn chain. What did Capablanca do? This you can carry through to your middle games. He went for the base of the chain and undermined that. Very instructive. Now, the next theme that we're going to do is exactly this, undermine the base using a pawn break. So the bishop moves round. Nice little plan from Capablanca. We've seen this. Part one of the to-do list, accomplished. We've kept that down. So now the knight is not going to be able to get across and interfere in any way, shape, or form. Next, step two, we simply bring the king round, ready for action. Now the point is the knight goes to f5. Timing is perfect. We push a5. Look at this pawn break. You're also learning what is a pawn break. Wonderful. Look how much you learn from with these endgames. You're getting this great understanding of so many themes about pawn structure, bishop versus knights, play on both sides, pawn structure of how do we play with an asymmetrical pawn structure? How do we use an outside pass pawn? Brilliant pawn break here with a5. So knight d6 check, no problem. King moves into a6, pawn takes. Now, what? This wasn't part of our plan because we wanted to win the pawn on c5. How should we play? The opponent has forgotten we can just push g7. Thank you very much. And we do win with the pass pawn, but I want you to see now how we have won with the pass pawn. all of black's resources were pulled across to the queen side. Very important. Dragged across, and then suddenly nothing stops the pawn. When we were earlier trying to get the pawn forward and we were only concentrating on this king side, this quadrant, we couldn't win. We threw everything there. The bishop, the king, they blockaded. But once we stretched the game, their position cracked. What an important example. And of course, if he did not play in this scenario check, if he simply captured, we would take here on c5. Why? Isolated pawns. They will all fall. We are going to win one by one. Go back and take this. If the knight moves, we'll take this pawn on d4 and then come back for the a5 pawn. What a spectacular example from this game in Capablanca. To summarize, we can see here how Capablanca has outplayed his opponent using these themes of plan number one, attack your opponent's weak pawns. But notice what he did. He fixed the opponent's structure and fixed a weak pawn on a light square. Then he set up the plan to go get that pawn. Next, once he created a pass pawn, he made that pass pawn very dangerous, so the opponent had to blockade it. That's important. Your pawn is not dangerous if it sits on your side of the board. You have to get the pawn forward to become a threat of promotion. Once his opponent's forces were committed to try and stop that pass pawn, he switched to the other side of the board and won those queenside pawns. Don't forget the procedure that Capablanca did, tying down the opponent and fixing those pawns. What a wonderful win. What a great example. So I hope you can sign up to the mailing list that we have for, of course, this notes and these themes on these endgames. And please do join me in endgame number 2 of the series of Capablanca's best chess endgames.